now I time myself because unlike my esteemed co-presenters, I did not actually write my paper. You get to hear me talk over slides, but then I have to make sure I don't talk too much. So I'm Diana Greenwald. I'm the curator of the collection at the Gardner Museum. And I'm in a bit of a different position to Isabella than my co-presenters and maybe many of you. I'm kind of employed by her. I joke, I wear a lanyard with her name on it every single day. And I joke that we should sometimes just ask her questions, maybe via Ouija board, how she feels about the exhibition program, what we've done to certain things. I hope she's happy. So I'm responsible for stewarding her collection and an institution that she created. And I think something I want to emphasize is the institution and Isabella are not the same thing. And who she is to the institution has changed over time. What she can mean can continue to change and evolve, how she's a touch point for us. So I bring a slightly different gaze from that perspective. Okay, where are we going today? I'm going to give a bit of a teaser of the religious art that's in the Gardner Museum. Spoiler alert to none of you, there is a lot of it, like a lot. It's funny because for another project, the team that I manage is in the midst of cataloging the collection from this specific perspective, which religions, what religious subject matter, really if we start counting how present is religion in the collection of, and I should say of many, many faiths. I'm going to give two examples of particular spaces that I think merit extra attention. One Natalie actually alluded to, as did Brother James, the Spanish chapel. And I think the quite strong presence of Catholicism, and I mean Roman Catholicism in this instance, in that space. And then also her engagement with Buddhism, both abroad and back home in the museum. And this really there'll be some biography, but it'll be quite grounded in the actual spaces in the museum. And then I'm going to leave you with some thoughts and questions. And as a preview to those thoughts and questions, the other thing I want to say about Gardner and sort of what it means to be a curator in her museum is that, we'll let Ian do this.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. But I can talk while Ian does tech support. So what I would say is Isabella Stewart Gardner is not a straightforward hero. Some people want her to be a feminist hero. She's not just a feminist hero. She is maybe in some moments, in other moments not so much. I'm sure there are people here who want her to be an Anglo-Catholic hero. And she's not going to be that in every moment. She thrills us and frustrates us and annoys us and is a flawed person, but also one who created a great thing. And so I think we should kind of keep that in mind, that she's not going to be exactly who you want her to be all the time, and that's okay. We certainly make peace with it at the museum as well, as we thank her for her generosity and her beautiful vision and the place that she created for us to steward and to hopefully welcome all of you. Okay, so religious art in the museum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about actual pieces, but I'm also going to talk about the different ways in which religious art is presented. The Gardner is not the only museum collection to have works like our incredible Fra Angelico, Dormition and Assumption of the Virgin from the 1400s. I love this piece. If you've ever come to see it, it's tucked away in a corner in our early Italian room. I often say that one of my favorite tips for exploring the Gardner is if a piece is adjacent to an exterior window, she probably really liked it. Why? Yeah, who just said it? Light, exactly. So we didn't have that much artificial light in the galleries when they first opened. The Gardner was not open to the public in Isabella's lifetime nearly as much as it is today, so it was shades up. So you got exterior light. And this piece gets pride of place. It's also presented, it'll be on a brown wall when you see it at the Gardner, but fairly straightforwardly like you might see in another museum gallery at the MFA, right? It's kind of just hung there as a painting. Then she has other approaches to religious art. And some of you will recognize this. It's been referenced multiple times today as the chapel at the end of the long gallery And what is its centerpiece? A stained glass window from Soissons Cathedral in France from the 1200s, with a very obscure local saint story, which I will not go into. Nor, I think some of you heard me respond to a question earlier, I am a Jewish girl from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and this was not in my Jewish day school education, as you can imagine. But, she's taken a cathedral window, a Catholic work of art, and she's placed it in her own chapel, which has been in use, constantly in her own lifetime and since her death, and therefore we consider consecrated. I actually think that's an interesting question about how it was consecrated and what consecrated means. But she's presented a religious work of art in a consecrated space. And so for real kind of, I would argue, religious art for religious use, not so common in museums. In fact, I think we might be the only art museum in the United States with consecrated space. But don't quote me on that yet, because I'm not 100% sure. Then, there are these arrangements where she takes religious art and creates things that feel religious, but you're not quite sure how. And it's kind of hard to put your finger on. I often say that one of the great gifts that Isabella Stewart Gardner gave to the museum, and Natalie referred to this before, was not explaining why she put anything anywhere. So no, I don't know why she did it this way. I have my ideas. Actually, this one I have some clear idea, which is why it's useful. It's a rare exception. I have my ideas, but just because I'm the curator of the collection, it doesn't mean that my theory is any more valid than a visitor's. We each make our own meaning in front of the museum. That meaning can change with each visit. I know my meaning making changes every time I wander through the galleries. And that's okay. And Isabella will never be there to tell us that we're right or wrong. And I think that's incredibly freeing. Now, occasionally, I don't know if I want to say she got sloppy in her archival record, because I don't think it's sloppy. I think she knew when she left something behind as a little bit of a breadcrumb. And this arrangement, actually right near the Fra Angelico, in our early Italian room, has a very particular story. The other charming thing about Gardner is that she rearranged her works of art all the time. Moved stuff, changed it, did that, did this. I do not have that privilege as her curator. A little bit in our new building, if you've seen our exhibitions, but not so much. But she moved things around. And this is an example where she moved something around. So this wonderful Lorenzetti of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was a gift. It was a gift from friends of hers who were the parents of the first American aviator killed in World War I. And she promptly rearranged part of the early Italian room to place this little figure, and there it is, right there, on a priestly cope, right below a giant San Niccolo, flanked by candlesticks and by textiles, and it really feels like a memorial, right? I think a theme that will come across again and again in her spaces. I think there's this really interesting crossover between spiritual and memorial for her. And so it's one of the rare examples where we sort of know why she did something. And it's for a very emotional reason, right? And so it's religious art, but it's deployed for really kind of personal meaning making. This young man was, as far as I know, not Catholic. I realize I should check that, but I think he was not. I don't think he was a great devotee of St. Elizabeth of Hungary. Natalie's giving me a shake of the head, so that's correct. And so, yet, she created what feels like a religious feeling tribute to him with the stuff of religious art. So we have a lot of these different situations throughout the museum, and these are just a few. The other thing I want to talk about is then sometimes when you think something's relatively straightforward, a Botticelli, which I think Natalie had up earlier, one of my absolute favorites. It's tucked in a corner of the long gallery. Completely gorgeous, an amazing halo. But what does Gardner put in front of this Italian Renaissance Catholic work of art? And I apologize for the quality of this image. It's a little hard to see. This is a mosque lamp right below. And so the other thing that she's prone to is really kind of creating interfaith dialogue, sometimes within the same arrangement, like we're seeing here, and certainly across spaces within the museum. So, as you were to wander the galleries of the museum, you have wandered through and around in front of all sorts of different confessions, the number of which I cannot yet tell you because we have not finished our cataloging. But I can guarantee you it's many, many faiths. And so I think, and the quote from Carter was really helpful, and I'm not going to weigh in on it here, but it's clear that she respected the art of many religions and deployed the pathos and the power of that art, right, strategically and in really interesting ways throughout the museum, which we're only really just, I think, starting to understand, and with the help of symposia like this. Because I'll put my cards on the table, the Gardner has not until recently spent a whole lot of time necessarily thinking about Isabella's faith per se, and what that means for us as a civic, secular institution. So, conjuring Catholicism in the Spanish chapel. We talked about Isabella's travels. She traveled a lot. I had the pleasure of doing a show about her travels a few years ago. And I think, if I'm remembering the number off the top of my head, she went to about 39 different countries using today's borders. I often like to say she did most of her traveling well before she was a major art collector. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's sort of a gathering of life experience for many, many years before she would really start collecting art in earnest, which is, we can talk about the different dates, but let's say around 1891. But here, we're looking at her second Spain album from her first trip to Spain, which happened in 1888. And can anyone spot her? Can you see her peeking out? Right there. By the time Gardner went to Spain, there was a fairly well-worn tourist path through Spain, which would have involved going to Madrid and the Prado. Her first album is almost entirely dedicated to the Prado, and then to the south of Spain, where there's, if you were to look at the guidebooks marketed to Americans at the time, a real interest in the exoticism of southern Spain, so both its Islamic past, to a certain extent it's still Roma present, and if anyone's seen El Jaleo, in our museum in the Spanish cloister with the big dancer painting, Sargent's image is very much out of this kind of fascination with southern Spain, but also the pageantry of Catholic worship, particularly in southern Spain. So if it's hooded penitents, paraded Madonnas, it is dramatic worship, and Gardner is actually there for Easter time in Seville in the 1880s. And so she's clearly taken with the experience. To the extent, let me go back and then we'll talk about it. To the extent, and Natalie mentioned this, that she actually makes one of her first old master paintings there of a Madonna and Child. We'll talk about it in detail later, which is the workshop of Francisco Zurbarán. I think it's telling that Gardner, who goes to Spain in 1888, includes it on her farewell tour to Europe in 1906. So her last trip abroad was in 1906, and she went to France, she went to Italy, she stops in the UK, places she'd been many times, but she makes a specific effort. She writes a letter to her business manager that she's been on dry ground for 3 days, or I think it's Sarah Orne Jewett, doesn't matter, and she's off to Madrid, right? And so she goes to Madrid. She complains about how the Prado is hung, and she wishes to be director and wants to rehang the whole thing. Yeah. She says the same thing about the Louvre. She did not lack for self-confidence. And she makes kind of vague references to going to the south. She talks about being deliciously cool. This is the summer, so I think it must have been Granada, which is at altitude, but we'll see. However, I think what's key is when she goes back in 1906, she's already plotting to tear down the music hall that had initially been connected to the courtyard, where now we have the Spanish chapel, the Spanish cloister, which is around the corner, the tapestry room, which you all know. She was already plotting to tear it down and do something new, and she's sort of planning these spaces. I don't think it's a coincidence that two of these spaces are named for Spain. You have a Spanish cloister, and this, the Spanish chapel. So we're going to talk about three works in the Spanish chapel that I think are particularly interesting. The Zuberon, which I sort of already referenced, a cross, which I'm just really interested in because we just found some cool stuff about it, and then this tomb figure. Okay. And I want to talk about also how this is presented. So this is work from the workshop of Francisco de Zuberon. I don't think we really care if it's workshop or if it's autograph. That's a boring subject for our historians. But I think, like I mentioned, this is purchased during her first trip to Seville. It's this Virgin of Mercy. Natalie put up that very provocative side-by-side of this and the image of Gardner and her only son, Jackie, who died before the age of 2. But what I think is so striking to me, and again, this is outsider in, so I'm really curious what all of you think. I mean, this is an altar, right? And this is a Catholic altar in a really, I think, fairly straightforward way that isn't, like, even the chapel with a stained glass window drop down feels a little bit more unconventional than this does. But I think, it's a first landmark purchase for her, that first Old Master purchase. It has this Madonna and child imagery that she would be drawn to again and again, and it clearly has some real significance for her, and it anchors the room. So that little cross, it's not the one in front of the altar, it's the one I sort of circled. I can go back so that you know what I'm talking about next time you go to the museum, there on the edge. She also puts this front and center. And this is just a digression that I think is interesting about what we continue to learn about our collection and why what I say in this talk, for all you know, will be irrelevant 2 years from now or whatnot. This cross came into Gardner's collection as Venetian. I don't think we've said this yet today, but she bought very little artwork in person. If you can believe it, most of the artwork is bought via photograph and telegram, including hugely expensive purchases, massively expensive purchases, and she's trusting her art advisors to source things. And so while she's been to many of the places that things are coming from, she's not actually seeing things in situ necessarily before buying them. So she buys this as Venetian. However, we just recently learned, and there are 2 of these in our collection, I should say, one here and one in another gallery. This is from Bethlehem. So it's made in Palestine. It's made by a Catholic community there that specializes in mother of pearl and wood inlay. They're best known for making models of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The MFA has one of these. They make other works as well. And, Bethlehem, whether Gardner knew this or not, and with our cataloging, it gets a little bit fuzzy, right? Because the receipt says one thing, then records will say something years later. She might have recognized this from her own trips there. This is a tradition that goes way back to the 1600s and was active when Gardner was a tourist in Bethlehem in the 1800s. And I think it's just so cool and beautiful that it has made it over here. And then a little bit of nerdy insider stuff. How do we know this is from Bethlehem, apart from the look of it and a connoisseurial view? This is made of pistachio wood. We were able to sample it. It's a shout out to our conservators. And so when we were repairing it, we got just a little bit of dust and we were able to figure it out. So again, just a really interesting, again, Catholic object that's here. And then this. So this tomb figure having just told you that Gardner buys almost everything at a distance, this is an exception. She buys this specifically on that 1906 trip from a dealer in Madrid, and she lays him out here. And I can't help but think, and James talked about this, Gardner was a meticulous planner. If anything, or the less generous version is a total control freak, which I do sometimes say to myself at work. So if we think about, I think my next slide is a space. So she buys this in 1906. She's 66 years old, right? She's not spring chicken, particularly for that era. And she puts him here when she creates these galleries in 1914-15, having knocked down the music room. And I can't help but imagine she's already thinking about her funeral plans, and James described this so beautifully, or by quoting the diary. She's laid out next to this knight in this chapel in front of the Madonna and Child, wow. Right? And that's where, who are the sisters? The sisters of?
St. Margaret and St. Anne.
Yeah, the sisters of St. Margaret and St. Anne are there with her. And I have to say, oh yeah, sorry, there's an arrow there. We're going to go back. And what is above her, right? So she's laid out there at the end of her life, but we get a little bit more of the story from what's on the walls here, which is probably something you've never noticed if you've been to the Gardner. It's hard to see. See those two arrows at the top? That was supposed to be an animation that clearly failed. So there are inscriptions there that Gardner commissioned from her friend, the painter Joseph Lyndon Smith. And so the first is in memoriam. I think Natalie has often interpreted that as for Jackie, for her son who passed away. I think it could be in memoriam for any number of people. Mm-hmm. It could be her, right? I mean, if she's planning this, and we know that she's a planner about her funeral, I think I like to think of it as a sort of general in memoriam for many people lost, perhaps for a visitor who's lost someone. And then there's this, which is has the feel of a Spanish prayer, right? And I was working on this. I was writing a paper sort of about Gardner in Spain, and it's driving me nuts because I can't find this thing anywhere. I'm like, where did she get this quote? And it's like, who is in the house of light? Who's in the house of joy? And my Spanish is failing me right now. And then something in faith, excuse me. But with the joys of Google, this should be easy, right? And it takes me forever, but I figured out where the heck this thing came from. And it came from this book, which is a memoir of a Scottish woman married to a Spaniard who's a diplomat in Mexico in the 1840s. And she describes seeing a Catholic indulgence on the house in some random town as they're going around Mexico. And this, the quote up here, is the first 3 lines of this indulgence that she's transcribed. Now, what do we see? Because this is actually in Gardner's library. So this is her, right? And then it's red, and she's a little, her handwriting can be a little tough, but it's read while at work at Fenway Court, June 1914. So she's building the galleries, she reads this book, she sees this secondhand Catholic indulgence from Mexico in 1840 and thinks, that feels right. I'll ask my friend Joseph Lyndon Smith to paint it on the wall. And I think we can either feel that, And before we move on to kind of her engagement with Buddhism, this can feel poetic, this can feel almost dilettantish, this can feel uncomfortable that she's taking like sort of serious Catholic art, and then she's like, oh, I'll use this nonfiction citation, right? But I think it's altogether really interesting and tells you the range of sources that could be inspirational and spiritual for her. And I think this particularly applies when it comes to Asian religions, and particularly Buddhism. And so I like to call this approximating Buddhism abroad and at home. Natalie, again, also mentioned this. She and Jack spent basically a year traveling through Asia from 1883 to 1884, and they go all over the place, including like Angkor Wat. She's probably the first American woman to go to Angkor Wat, which is really amazing. She leaves a diary behind. There were some questions about the resources that she leaves in her wake. I like to think that as she got more famous, she left fewer sources. And it's sort of nice that she traveled so much before she's notable, because there are a couple of diaries. And so I think if we read part of this, where she's going to a temple, right? The ladder, so she's at Temple of Confucius, the ladder of a strange and very interesting architecture, court after court, all the lamas in yellow cloaks and such strange yellow hats. Services going on, one of them in open court, consisting of odd chanting in very low voices, with an accompaniment of clapping two pieces of wood, in one of their temples, a very large gilded Buddha standing. And the diary is full of experiences like this. She's basically kind of having an aesthetic experience with Buddhism at the time. Again, not uncommon. There are a whole series of Bostonians running around Asia having this sort of experience, but I think it gives you a sense of her openness to feeling moved by lots of religious settings. As a side note, putting her diary next to Jack's diary, which is traveled 12 kilometers, spent X number on sandwich. You can see they were different people. So she's collecting these experiences, which I think is really relevant for the museum, but I just want to emphasize she's not necessarily collecting great art yet, right? So she comes home, this is a little cabinet in the little salon, it's one of my favorites. She comes home with little, what she calls curios. They're opium bottles, they're Japanese netsuke, they're all sorts of cool things, but they're small. And she's basically a tourist. And so I think what she really gets out of her travels is not necessarily stuff, but it's these experiences like in these temples that she's going to try to bring home. And there are lots of them. And she goes to, I think this is, I'm going to do this and I'm going to go back and I'm probably going to make sense. And it's not just Buddhism per se, and I think that's part of it. She's sort of experiencing a range of Asian religions at once. This I love. This is a view of the Ganges. So she's in India in 1884. But we worked with a scholar named Siddhartha Shah, who's a curator of South Asian art, when I was working on this travel show, and he realized these images are not actually, this is not actually a view that you can get of the Ganges. These are banks seen from different sides that are actually next to each other, and she's faced them to create this huge panorama, to kind of conjure this feeling of grandeur, of being moved. And I'm quoting Siddhartha when he says she has kind of an eat, pray, love moment in India, and she writes sort of some random prayer underneath, which is not a real prayer. And in this mode, and forgive me for being out of order, she also tries to meet with this woman, whose name is Madame Blavatsky. Ah, yes. So unfortunately, Madame Blavatsky is not home when she goes to see her in then Madras, now Chennai, but who's the founder of Theosophy. So a 19th century kind of new religious movement that is blending all sorts of influences from Hinduism and Buddhism, and there's this kind of pan-Asian thing going on. And Gardner is open to this and interested and sort of excited by it. And I think this is what she's really going to bring home with her when she gets back to Boston. Again, I'm repeating Natalie, so forgive me, and I'm amazed with all your patience to spend a full day talking about Gardner. But this really kind of cements back in Boston, and when she's actually become an art collector and she's actually working on the museum or has opened the museum by meeting Okakura Kakuzo, who's a scholar, who's the first curator of Asian art at the MFA Boston, who kind of incredibly splits his time between Tokyo and Boston, which is quite the feat when you think that I think he took up his position in 1904. And Okakura becomes kind of a guide for Gardner in understanding different Asian religions. A little scholarly, but also there's a romanticism there. And there's been a lot of scholarship about Okakura and his sort of engagement with the West. And he kind of cultivates, there's a wonderful essay called Bells and Smells that was written by a professor at Notre Dame about Gardner and other Bostonians engaging with, in this case, Buddhism and Catholicism. And he cultivates kind of a group of what you would describe as sort of Buddhist sympathizers, right, among people who are of other faiths. And he does this with actual kind of texts and learnings, and he's not trying to convert anyone, but also through, and what you're seeing here is an inscription from him on his opera libretto called The White Fox. And it starts, right, with through godly deeds seek higher incarnation, in Buddha's mercy trusting. And this is at the beginning of an opera libretto. It's a really interesting kind of hybrid approach to a religion that really seems to connect with Gardner, and they become very good friends. And then once again, this kind of in memoriam theme comes back. Okakura dies in 1913. It's just as Gardner, I mentioned, was working on the Spanish chapel. She's redoing this part of then Fenway Court, now the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and she creates a Chinese room in the basement underneath, basically off the Chinese loggia. And you're asking, where is this now, right? And the answer is, unfortunately, very unfortunately, in the 1970s, it was disassembled, and some of the art was deaccessioned. It was considered not part of the first, second, and third floors of the museum because it was in the basement. And the fourth floor, as many of you may or may not know, is where the directors lived and was not covered by the will, so there was sort of precedent for this. There were spaces on the campus that were not protected. But I think what we can see even from this picture, and I'll show you some of the objects that we do still have in the collection, one of my predecessors, Alan Chong, calls this the culmination of Gardner's long dialogue with Asia, and I think that's right. But it's also, I think, a little bit, sometimes like the Catholic feel of the Spanish chapel, it can feel a little dilettantish, right? We have all these things like different Buddhas, and like she had her amazing Genji screens, which are not Buddhist at all, right? They're Japanese and from the 1600s, and show the first novel, The Tale of Genji, all in this space that she says is dedicated to Okakura, and I should say his tea set is somewhere over there, along there. And he participated in a tea ceremony at the museum. And so she's sort of approximating, I would argue, some of that experience that she had in Asia all those years ago, filtered through all these different traditions, and they've been sort of smashed together, but incorporated in the museum, including screens. And then this is where it actually is. So it's down here, down these stairs. It's empty now. It's just, but we do, I'd like to emphasize, still have some really important works of Buddhist art in the collection. These are two of them, although my colleague, Gabrielle Mew, would say that this is Buddhist and also Taoist and also indigenous religion, so it's a complicated object. But Gardner, at the end of her life, these are two very late purchases. Now, some might say that she turned to Buddhist art because she got outcompeted and outpriced for Italian Renaissance art, a market that she had helped create, and then was quickly getting kicked out of by Henry Clay Frick and J.P. Morgan. Oh, is there booing? Oh, good. Sure, let's boo away. She actually as a side note, she liked Frick, and they dined next to that Salamancan tomb figure. he started his life at one point before she finished her work in the West Cloister. And Frick brought her flowers, and they sort of laid them at the feet of this tomb figure together. So I don't know what we want to read into that. Anyway, but I think what's really telling about her commitment to interest in other faiths and religious art of other faiths is that this guanyin, so a bodhisattva, was her last real purchase. She sends a message confirming that she would like to buy it from a Paris dealer in very late 1919, and soon after she would suffer a stroke. And she would stop being as active a collector and curator of her space. And so you wonder what would have happened had she stayed engaged and fit longer. Would this be an even more pronounced presence within the museum? Okay, so some concluding thoughts and questions. And I promise I'm not trying to be too provocative. What does it mean to have a chapel in an art museum? The Gardner is very clearly an art museum. That doesn't really, enjoyment and education of the public forever. Although another side note and anecdote is that the US government at one point disagreed with her about how public her museum was, and it involved a little bit of a tax dispute. Everyone hates taxes, right? No, I'm kidding. But what does it mean to have, and this is, a sort of at the end of one's journey through the museum, or towards the end of one's journey, does it mean that art is sacred? Some people have argued that Gardner is pioneering sort of an aesthetic religion, a kind of syncretic, cross-denominational, therapeutic aesthetic religion. Is it that she didn't want these two parts of her lives as someone who was guided by SSJE and by Church of the Advent to be fully segregated from her museum, which she knew was going to be part of her legacy? She's trying to integrate her religiosity into the collection and into the museum permanently, particularly by being very clear in the will that we have to do this Mass, or I shouldn't say this Mass, this memorial service is the direct quote, every year on her birthday, which I have to say is also a charming little bit of hubris. And I don't know, right? I don't know what this means. I think it's provocative. I think it suggests that she understood the museum as a more emotional place than your average museum. It's not an encyclopedic museum. It's not rigid. But as we said, she didn't leave anything behind. So my answer is not the same as any of yours might be. But how does this square with her kind of piety as an Anglo-Catholic? How does her being so omnivorous about all these different religions fit with personal piety? And I don't know. It's just sort of interesting to think about in terms of her as a person. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing I'll add, and this is a new slide, so I don't know that Ian saw this, but we've talked about this. So this is the chapel. Often people enter, they sort of circumnavigate the courtyard, they go up the second floor, they actually go this way, up the second floor, go up to the third floor. You come to this, if you hit it on the right type of day, it's like a beautiful spray of color. But then you make a right. And you come to the Gothic room, which was officially closed to the public during her lifetime, although semi-visible. And she's in the corner waiting for you with a halo behind her. And this is actually sacred music. Antiphonary, it's from Naples from the 1600s. Before we put a stanchion and an alarm there, it was the most touched thing in the collection. She sort of put herself, some of our museum teachers get very angry when I say this because they think I'm sort of insulting her, but I really am not trying to. It feels like an altar to herself a little bit. And how does that square with her as a pious person? What does that mean? I don't think there's a problem with that. I think it's incredible, and I think it's bold, and I think it's trying to affirm her presence when she understood that she was leaving with her lack of records, kind of a profound absence. But I'm grateful to her. Every time I walk into the Gothic room, I'm grateful for the way she presides over the museum. I'm grateful for the endowment she left us that helps pay for me. And I'm endlessly impressed that her name and legacy can continue to fill rooms like this on a Saturday to welcome all of you. And with that, I will stop here, and if anyone has questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you very much.